Hi, friends. Rick Edwards here with Sunday School University. Thank you for joining me for another episode or lesson regarding the Gospel Project. This particular video is going to be another contextual video, which means it's not specific to a lesson or a session, but is rather a video that provides some context for the lesson. And this one we're calling the land in the book of Kings, or the land in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. We're calling it that way because originally the book of 1st and 2nd Kings was one book, just the book of Kings. And so I may refer to it as the book of Kings, or I may refer to it as the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. But we're talking about how these two books, or this one book, the book of Kings, treats the notion of the land. Because the land, the promised land, the land of Canaan, the land that we're talking about as we move through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, plays a very significant role, and it will help us understand the stories that we encounter in the book of Kings if we will understand the role that the land plays. So let's just jump right on into this. First of all, I want to remind you that the purpose of the book of Kings is to help us see that the human monarchy that was in place really all the way back to the beginning, King Saul, even King David, King Solomon, and then certainly all the kings that followed who were kings in the northern tribe or the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. All those kings, while some were good, most were bad, but the monarchy itself did not work. So you get to the end of the book of 2nd Kings, the book of Kings, and the conclusion you draw is pretty straightforward, is that the monarchy has failed. The monarchy has not accomplished what God wanted it to accomplish in the life of Israel. Okay, so that's the purpose of the book of Kings. Now, what's the relationship of this business of the land? Well, the consequence of the failed monarchy, the consequence or the consequences of the monarchy not accomplishing what it was supposed to do, the failure of the monarchy, the consequence of that was the loss of the land. First, in the northern kingdom of Israel, they kept sinning and sinning. They had no good kings, according to the record in 1st and 2nd Kings, no good kings. And eventually, God allowed the nation of Assyria from the north to come in and conquer Israel, the northern kingdom, and essentially disperse or take away all the people of the northern kingdom, so that for all practical purposes, the people of the northern kingdom and their descendants are now lost. We call them the lost tribes of Israel. The 10 tribes of Israel, for all practical purposes, are now gone as of around 722 BC, because the monarchy was evil, and consequently the people were evil. They did not keep the covenant, and consequently they lost, as a consequence, they lost the land in which they were living. Eventually, the same thing happened in the southern kingdom of Judah, although it took another 140 years or so for this to happen. Eventually, Babylon comes in, conquers Judah, destroys Jerusalem, and take the people. Now, they didn't disperse the people the way Assyria did. Babylon deported the people to Babylon, but took the people out of the land. So the people lost the land. So in both cases, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, in both cases, the consequence of the failed monarchy was the loss of land. And this was very, very apparent, uppermost in the mind of the author of the book of Kings. So all through, he's making the point that the monarchy is not going to work, because he's writing after the fact, all looking back on all this history. He's looking at it and making the point that the monarchy is not working, and the result is going to be the loss of the land. Now, let's jump in and talk about Israel's relationship to the land. Israel's relationship to the land actually goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, when God called Abraham. And you'll recall that Abraham been living in the land of Ur. He eventually made his way with his father up to the northern part, not a little bit north of the Canaan land. And then God says, Abraham, I want you to leave your people, leave your land, and I want you to go to a land that I'm going to show you. It turns out to be the Canaan land, what would become the promised land, what is Israel today. And God says in Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, one of these days I'm going to give all of this land, the Canaan land, I'm going to give to your descendants. And that's when he promises the land to Abraham's descendants. And that's where we get the notion of the promised land, this land in which Abraham was traveling as a stranger, a sojourner in the land of promise. He wasn't the owner yet, but eventually, when they came back out of Egypt after being in captivity for over 400 years, eventually they made their way back up. They conquered this land, and the promised land became a reality. So the roots of this promised land go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 7. And all along, Israel had this unique relationship with the land because God perceived that the land was going to be a blessing to them. The land was going to be a gift to them. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit and how this works out. Now, I want to point out also that when they come out of Egypt and they end up at Mount Sinai and God gives them the law, part of the law, the Torah, restricted how the land could be sold and bought once they got to the land, because once they got into the land and conquered it, the land was going to be divvied up and divided up among the tribes and among the families so that the families would have land. And the Torah, the law, prescribed how the land could be bought and sold, and it was pretty restrictive. And the idea was that if your family had land, you were supposed to hold on to that land. That land was supposed to stay in the family. It was pretty significant. And all that becomes significant, as we're going to see, as we move further into the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, in the book of Kings, the land was perceived as God's land. This was always the case, and you could say this about everywhere through the Old Testament, but certainly in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, the land was perceived as God's land. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, several things I would note. If the land is God's land, then I would note that idolatry defiled the land. Idolatry, when you start worshiping other gods within the land that was God's gift to you, then you have defiled the land. I don't know if you've ever had someone break into your home, but people who have will often talk about the sense that when they come back home and they know that someone has broken in, that someone has been there that wasn't supposed to be there, it feels as though the home has been violated or defiled. And that's what happened when God's land became a place for idols and idolatry to exist, for idols to be worshipped there, especially if they were fertility gods like Ashtoreth and Baal. Now, fertility gods and fertility worship involve the worship of these gods for the sake of gaining their blessing on the land and on the crops. And people believed if we worship these false gods in a certain way, usually through acts of sex, if we worship gods in a certain way, then they will bless our crops and we will have greater fertility in the land. And so these false gods, these fertility gods, often were brought in, and they were brought into God's land. Keep in mind, it was God's land that he had turned over as to Israel to be stewards of the land. And now here they are, rather than honoring the God who's given them this land, they are bringing in these idols and worshiping these other gods, especially these fertility gods. Now think about this. Here they are, they're living in God's land, and God, Yahweh, is the sovereign God of the universe. He is the creator, so he made everything that is. He's in charge of everything related to the earth. He's in charge of all the people. He's in charge of the weather. And yet here they are bringing in these false gods and praying to these false gods and asking these false gods to bless their crops and to bless the land, as though God is powerless to do so. So idol worship, especially fertility worship, was an especially egregious and affront to God, because it said basically, God, you're no longer, this is not your land. These other gods have more power over the land than you do. So idolatry defiled the land. Very important. So whenever you read about these kings worshiping other gods and allowing idolatry to exist in the land, it was a way of defiling the land from God's perspective. We also need to point out that if the land became commercialized too much, commercialization of the land disregarded God's ownership of the land. And again, this goes back to what happened and what was prescribed in the Torah. God restricted how land could be bought and sold because it was never to be viewed as a commodity, a neutral thing that could just be bought and sold. The land in which they lived was to be treated as a gift from God, a blessing from God, and therefore the people who owned the land had to be very careful about how they did transactions, how they bought and sold the land, because it was not really their land. But when the land became too commercialized, as we see in the story of Ahab and Naboth, which we'll get to in that lesson, but when land became too commercialized, it disregarded God's ownership. It was treated as though it was just a commodity, a thing to be bought and sold. And God's land was never to be perceived as a commodity. So commercialization of the land disregarded God's ownership. And remember, in the book of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, the land is perceived as God's land. So beware of commercialization. And finally, I would note that the land in the book of Kings served God's purpose for Israel. So not only was it God's, but because it was God's, he intended for the land to be a blessing to the people, and consequently, the land would provide what Israel need in order to accomplish their purpose. Now, you remember all the way back in Genesis 12, God says to Abraham, I want to bless the world through you. So Israel now, the land, the promised land in which Israel is going to live, the land is to become, in essence, an outpost of God's people, from where they can then go out and bless other nations. And we see this happening under Solomon. When Solomon was king, his reign and the people are actually blessing other nations around them, which is how it was supposed to be. So the land was to be an outpost of God's presence and God's blessing and God's people, so that he could bless them or bless these other nations through his people. And the land served that purpose, Israel's purpose. Okay, now, a couple more things I want to point out. Judgment in the book of 1 Kings, judgment involved losing the land. And over, what we see is, as you're reading through the books of 1 and 2 Kings, the sense you're going to get is that the people are putting the land at risk because they are not following the covenant. They're not living as they're supposed to live. They're practicing idolatry. They're doing all these terrible things. And consequently, they're putting the land at risk. Okay? And ultimately, what we discover is, because of their sin, because of their idolatry, God says, okay, you're going to lose the land. And that happened with the northern kingdom. They are, as I mentioned earlier, they're conquered by Assyria, and they lose the land in 722 BC. They're dispersed. They never come back. At least they haven't yet. And so if you'll read 2 Kings 17, verse 18, it summarizes the fact that they have lost the land. They've gone into exile. They've lost the land because of their sin. And then if you jump over, that was Israel, the northern tribe, northern kingdom. If you jump over to 2 Kings 25, verse 21, you're going to read how God allowed Judah, the southern kingdom, to be taken into captivity, to lose the land, as we're saying, to lose the land as part of the judgment that God is bringing upon them. So this is the primary thing, the primary act of judgment in the books of 1 and 2 Kings. That's why I say that the consequence of the failed monarchy is that they lose the land. Okay? Very, very important. So, finally, when you read through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and you encounter stories that involve the land, allow this context to inform how you read that. For example, when Elijah confronts Ahab and says, God has told me that it's not going to rain, and it didn't rain for 3 years. Now think about this. If the land is God's, but the people are worshiping these fertility gods and praying for the fertility gods to bring rain, what's a perfect way for God to remind the people that He's the owner of the land, that He's the God of the land, not these fertility gods? So he says to Elijah, I'm going to stop the rain. I'm going to bring drought. I'm not going to let it rain for 3 years. And so for those 3 years, the people are being heard, well, this is happening because God is mad at us. Meanwhile, they're out here praying to their false gods, make it rain, make it rain, make it rain. And guess what? Their false gods don't answer because they don't have power over the weather. They don't own the land, but God does. And so stories like the drought and Elijah announcing the drought helped underscore the fact that the land is God's land. And then I would point out the story of Ahab and Naboth, which we're going to be looking at soon if you haven't already looked at it. The story of Ahab and Naboth involves a vineyard. And while it's a small thing, there's only one verse. Ahab goes to Naboth and says, I want to buy your land. He even offers him a fair price for it, or I'll give you better land for it. Naboth, in a very, very simple one verse, Naboth says, can't do it. I will never sell you my father's land. Okay, I will never part with it. In that context, what Naboth is saying is that I got this land from God. It has been passed down to me through the generations. The land was a gift from God to my family. We cannot part with it. So Naboth's refusal to sell the land to Ahab was an act of faithfulness to the covenant. It was an act of obedience to God. And it represents the fact that Naboth, is still faithful to the Lord, even though Ahab and his wife Jezebel have taken Israel into a terrible place in terms of idolatry and such. But for Naboth, it was an act of faithfulness. So again, as you read stories that involve the land, keep in mind all that we've talked about here. The land belonged to God, and as such, the people were supposed to treat the land with respect and treat it as though it was God's land. Very, very important stuff, very, very important context for understanding the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you for listening.